buds, and welcome to another episode of Keeping Karlsson Short Shifts, your twice-weekly or tweekly podcast dedicated to keeping you up to date in between the episodes of the mega episodes of Keeping Karlsson delivered to you every Sunday night. My name is Ben Burnett, and I am joined, of course, by my co-host, Louis Ezekiel. Louis, how are you doing tonight?
Oh, I'm having a good one, Ben. Really thrilled to have picked up Alex Tuch the other night. I got a nice suggestion from fellow teacher at Shane C. Thompson about grabbing him. I didn't get him for his 2-goal night, but I got him for his 3-assist night today. Really enjoying having him on the team. Looks like he took Glass's spot on Power Play 1 for the Golden Knights, so somebody to maybe keep an eye on moving forward. He got 16 minutes tonight, including 2.5 on the power play.
We are, of course, brought to you by Keeping Karlsson. Louis and I tweet together at AVG Time on Ice. That is our Twitter account. You can, of course, and you should, of course, also follow at Keeping Karlsson on Twitter. So we are going to start with two major headlines, and that is the coaching changes in Calgary and New Jersey. First of all, we're going to talk about Calgary. And so what we've seen today is some lines from practice that are a total shakeup of what we've come to expect from Calgary over the past few years. We're so used to seeing Johnny and Sean on top line with Elias Lindholm, and then a second line that's centered around Backlund and Tkachuk. Michael Frolik has spent some time there. They were dubbed the 3M line for a while. They've kind of been up and down with the right winger on that line, but for the longest time, those 5 players have been stuck in their position, and based on practice lines today, things have changed. So, the top line saw Elias Lindholm at center with Matthew Tkachuk and Andrew Magniapane on the right side. Monahan was on a separate line playing with Backlund and Dylan Dubé, while Johnny Gaudreau was all the way down on line 3 with Milan Lucic and Derek Ryan. The Flames do have until Thursday off, and so their interim coach Jeff Ward said that he wanted to try something different in practice before seeing it in a game. So I ask you, Louis, are there big takeaways? Is there anything concrete that we can take from the lines that we saw reported today at practice?
The way I'm sort of looking at this is I'm hoping that we're seeing kind of, not a troll job exactly, but just, trying some things out for the sake of trying them out in Calgary and see what goes on. I honestly, though, wouldn't necessarily be surprised to see Johnny Gaudreau start somewhere down the lineup in the middle 6. Just because he seems to need some kind of spark, and maybe the coach is trying to give him a kick in the pants and challenge him to really elevate his game, because he has obviously been letting down his owners so far this season.
I think one thing that gets lost a lot of the time in conversations when we're looking at practice lines is that the difference between line 1 and line 3 has legitimately changed quite a bit. Teams aren't just stacking all of their best players on the top line and then putting grinders on that third line, right? So when we look at lines that split up, sometimes we'll see a report of lines from practice and somebody's down on line 3 and you're like, whoa, why is that player on line 3? And really it just means that they're running out as the third line in a line drill. They may be the third line that gets played in the game, but they're not getting minutes that they're the 9th most important player on the forward group. So that was my first thought when I saw Johnny Gaudreau on line 3. Once I realized that he was with Milan Lucic and Derek Ryan, though, I realized, oh no, this is for sure the checking line. Johnny Gaudreau is not being put in a position where he could potentially elevate middling offensive players. He's being put with some offensive anchors, and so that's definitely the one thing here that I'm not into. Honestly, Monahan playing on the wing would be amazing for my fantasy team if he could get that left wing eligibility. I think he and Backlund would be fine together. Seeing Lindholm, Tkachuk together is great. And honestly, as a quasi-Flames fan living just outside of Calgary as I do, I've always liked Andrew Magniapane. He has been one of the Flames' 4th best forward. He's been the 4th best forward on the Flames by Evolving Hockey's goals above replacement stat. He hasn't been super productive this year, but I think that he's someone who could shine if given a top 6 role, and I've wanted to see him there for a while. So overall, definitely I'm not stoked as a Johnny Gaudreau owner, but the top 6, there aren't any huge red flags outside of the Gaudreau placement here.
So hopefully if we see some positive regression from Johnny, we can see him maybe improve a little bit. Do you think it's possible that he could get back on pace? Certainly he's not going to meet last year's points totals, barring a real offensive explosion. But do you see him, climbing back at some point to a 70, 80-point pace?
So the interesting thing with Gaudreau is that when you look at those underlying numbers, his even strength on ice shooting percentage, his IPP, these numbers are at career low or near career low for him. And if you regress those numbers up to his career averages instead, you'd expect him to have closer to about 80 points right now. He would be about a point per game guy. Maybe not the 95-point guy you were hoping for when you drafted him. Maybe you reached for him in a league. I would understand that. But definitely better than the 55 points that he's pacing for right now. So to me, Johnny Gaudreau is a definite buy. If you can go out and get him for a 60-point player, a 50-point player even, go out and do that right now, 5 minutes ago, 10 minutes ago. Get out there and make that deal.
Yeah, I like it. So, yeah, I think everyone in hockey would be quite happy, I think, to see Johnny Gaudreau up there. Certainly he is poorly set up for his role on a checking line with Milan Lucic, as one thing that we know about Gaudreau is that contact is not something he is actively seeking out.
Yes, that is absolutely correct. And Coach Ward today said that he is looking at experimenting. So my hope will be that we'll see something similar to these lines, but maybe with Gaudreau bumped up. I wouldn't mind seeing Gaudreau in that Dylan Dubé spot on the second line with Monahan and Backlund. I think that could be a really, really interesting line, and leave Tkachuk and Lindholm with Magniapane and see what they can do. I think that would be a pretty solid top six, and at the very least, if it doesn't work out, that there are other lines that have worked in the past. Lewis, we got to move on to the second coaching change that we've seen, and that happened today. John Hynes finally fired in New Jersey after getting smoked by Buffalo 7-1 last night. Alan Nesradine, formerly, as you noted to me earlier, of Michael Scott's favorite team, the Wilkes-Barre Scranton Penguins, has taken over in New Jersey, and we saw some new lines. Kind of a twist on some old lines. Rather than the traditional Palmieri, Hischier, Hall line, Jesper Boqvist was up with that unit to start the game, while Taylor Hall was toiling down with Pavel Zacha and Jesper Bratt. Nikita Gusev stayed with Zajac and Coleman, and then Wayne Simmons on the fourth line with Kevin Rooney and Miles Wood. Hall ended up getting some time with Hischier and Palmieri throughout this game, so I'm thinking in his first game in the NHL, Nesradine didn't shake things up too much. The top power play, of course, still missing Jack Hughes, included Nico Hischier, Palmieri, Gusev, Vatanen, and Hall, just as we expected. So we didn't see the instant jump up into the top unit for PK Subban, but instead the continuing hold for Sami Vatanen on that top power play unit. Do you have a sense of players who have a shot at raising their stock as a result of the John Hynes firing?
Nice to see Hischier go out there and get another goal in as many nights. They were up against Malcolm Subban, who was playing his second game in net in as many nights, and that might have helped them be a little more successful offensively than they might have been otherwise. But a nice bounce back, I think, from a 7-1 defeat to only lose 4-3. Baby steps here, I think, in New Jersey. I would hope to see PK Subban eventually reassert his position on that top line. If he is waiting around on your waiver wire, it might be worth investigating. But as you said, we didn't see major changes quite yet from Nesradine behind the bench in New Jersey. And those changes might not come. We may see Sami Vatanen ride out, at least the next while in that power play one spot. But since PK has been essentially droppable up to this point, it'll be interesting to see if the fast hand will be able to pick him up and he'll be productive moving forward.
I do think if there are any gains to be made from the John Hynes firing, it would be someone like Taylor Hall, whose shooting percentage is just already so low that he's due for a lot of regression. So I would expect to see, for example, his 4.1 shooting percentage to bounce right back up to closer to 10% on the season. That would give him about 10 goals this year as opposed to the 4 that he has, and put him just above a point per game pace. I don't know that that's necessarily a result of John Hynes being fired. That seems to be more of a shooting percentage regression issue. But absolutely, I think that the top players in New Jersey may have an opportunity to regress. And then my hope would be as well, these guys like Taylor Hall with a -11 on the year, hopefully Nasruddin is able to implement a defensive structure that allows them to give up fewer goals and maybe could even help a Mackenzie Blackwood who struggled in his sophomore season in nets.
Yeah, really good points. I think sort of reasserting the natural order of things might be the first business with the new interim coach. He's not maybe under the pressure to kind of mix and match the lines in the same way that Hines was, just trying to find anything that would work, and it might allow for a more natural hierarchy to start to emerge.
Absolutely. Let's get into a few injuries before we get into our second segment here. Nothing massive. Don't worry, folks. We're not dealing with another Mikko Rantanen or a Mitch Marner. Patric Hornqvist, who's been cold since returning from injury, got hurt once again. Lewis, what is the result of the Patric Hornqvist injury?
So he had been playing on the wing with McCann and Cahoon. Now the second line consists of Galchenyuk, McCann, and Stefan Noesen. The pronunciation optional on that one. We'll see how things shake out on game day for the Penguins, who don't play again until Wednesday night, the evening that hopefully you are listening to this podcast. So we'll see how that turns out. Not especially interested in that second line right now. McCann was interesting when he was with Malkin. Now that he's not. It also does give Galchenyuk an opportunity to play some more on that top power play. You know, certainly each of these injuries really piling up, making things tough defensively. So we've seen both Tristan Jarry and Matt Murray struggle as of late. Jarry overall still has the superior season, and we talked last week about how we're kind of entering that lull period for Matt Murray. So we might see it go back and forth for a little while longer. But yeah, with Hornqvist kind of, as you said, struggling a little bit before going out, I don't know that this makes huge waves for...
Sounds about right to me. The second injury, of course, in Minnesota. Jared Spurgeon left the game in the first after taking a shot from Sasha Barkov. Did not return. Obviously something worth monitoring. I would recommend checking out Game Day Lines at GameDayLines.com to see how those lines shake out the next time the Wild hit the practice ice. And Lewis, one more outjury of sorts. Not really a player who was injured, but maybe his pride was injured after missing so many games recently?
I think it has to have been. So Kyle Turris was able to get back into the Predators lineup after 7 games as a healthy scratch. He really looked primed to go. He recorded a power play goal and an assist playing 16 minutes. The power play goal was beautiful. He found the slimmest space between Rene's skate and the post on a one-timer off a feed from Matthias Ekholm. But I think we need to caution just a little bit. I think some of this is kind of the adrenaline rush of being back, but it's also worth pointing out that Ryan Johansson was ejected following an elbowing major, which would have opened up some more prime deployment for Kyle Turris to skate in. So I would say wait until we see a couple games with Ryjo back in the lineup and see what kind of deployment Turris is getting and if he can keep up his pace. But definitely someone to keep an eye on now that he is back from his exile.
It looks like Kyle Turris was skating between Daniel Carr and Kalle Järnkrok for the Preds, so definitely not going to get overly excited about that at even strength. Obviously, Turris did see some second power play unit usage as well. I'm not overly excited about Kyle Turris as long as Peter Laviolette is in Nashville, unless, of course, he starts to put together some productivity and actually shows that he can do it, but definitely not as excited as I would have been a few years ago when Kyle Turris was looking like a legit offensive option on an actual NHL team. And I'm not sure that the Preds qualify as an actual NHL team these days.
Harsh, but fair. He did have some moments last year, certainly, where he was fantasy relevant. You got to kind of pick your spots with him. Stream him in when he's hot and drop him pretty quick once he starts to cool off.
Absolutely. Lewis, we are going to move on to our final segment of today's show. This is a snoozer-based segment. though we are going to give it a little bit of a subtitle. We've each picked a forward and a defenseman that we're about ready to give up on 25 games in. We're going to ask, is it time to hold out hope or dump his ass? Lewis, I'm going to start with Phil Kessel in Arizona, 77% owned in Yahoo, so he is not available in any league that I'm in. He's also owned in 100% of Cupful divisions, the Keeping Karlsson Ultimate Patron Fantasy League, of course, the best fantasy league in the world, run by Brian and Elon, where each patron of Keeping Karlsson is sorted into different tiers, different divisions, and they are all competing with extremely dedicated fantasy managers. The toughest league I'm in, the most fun league I'm in. Become a patron of Keeping Karlsson so you can join and compete against us. But Phil Kessel owned in each one of those Cupful leagues. I am going to ask, should he be dropped? So, before tonight's power play assist, Kessel had 4 points over a stretch of 13 games. His 42-point pace is barely rosterable in shallow leagues, much less the Cupful, a league where people are struggling to find, even a 50, 55-point pace off the waiver wire. The Yotes in general just haven't been a big scoring team this year. They're 20th in the league in goals for, and that's been a very balanced attack for them. Nick Schmaltz leads the team with 20 points through their first 28 games, while Kessel is tied for 5th as of this recording with 15 points. Definitely not what we would have expected from Kessel 28 games into the season after he was first traded to the Coyotes. I remember talking with folks in the offseason, is Kessel or Keller going to lead this team in points? Which of them is more likely to hit 70 points was kind of the discussion. And right now it's definitely looking like neither. Now, there are some good signs with Phil Kessel that I've found. He is leading the team in power play time on ice every game. That's good. His on-ice shooting percentage is also very low at even strength, which usually means that we should see some regression. His expected goals for per 60 is also still more or less in line with the Pittsburgh days. I do have some adjusted expectations for Kessel moving forward, though. I do think his power play pace of around 20 points is fairly sustainable. Where I do think he should see gains, though, is at even strength, where that on-ice shooting percentage and IPP should regress just a little bit, and if you do regress it to his career averages, I think that would net him about an extra 4 or 5 points. So I expect this point pace to be around 57 if he were to get the right bounces. Rest of season, I think 60-ish points sounds about right for Kessel. So in deeper leagues, I'd hold for a bit longer just because the upside obviously is so high. We've seen him be a point-per-game player as recently as last year. But if I'm in shallow leagues where 60-point players are on the waiver wire, I'm happy to stream him out until we start to see some actual returns to form, because I'm not sure that the ceiling is there in the same sense that it was before.
Yeah, I think this is just what a lot of us were sort of worried about in the offseason as Kessel made his way to the desert. Would he be able to keep up these Pittsburgh-esque numbers without the same sort of offensive acumen among the forwards in Arizona? And, really was he capable of sort of carrying his own weight, and could he drive the play as he starts to age a little bit and slide down the other end of the aging curve? Definitely been a challenge for him so far.
Lewis, why don't you tell us the first snoozer that you looked into tonight?
It would be my pleasure. Now, I have to say I'm a little concerned about him just because we have had some development since I presented him, but I'm going to stick to my guns here. So I'm talking about Matt Dumba, 79% owned in Yahoo, 80% owned in the Cupful. He's had his position on Power Play 1 usurped by a productive Spurgeon, and he finds himself this year at merely a 26-point pace. Now, this is way out of line with the expectations that many of us had for Dumba in the offseason. We saw him as a double-digit goal-scoring defenseman last year, which was quite a rare breed, and a lot of people thought, myself included, that this is someone who could have led defensemen in goal-scoring potentially, maybe getting as high as 15 or even 20 in really ideal circumstances. Obviously, that has not come to pass. The offense has dried up to a large degree in Minnesota, although they're picking it up a little bit more recently. Getting into his numbers here, he is experiencing the worst IPP in his last 3 years, but the offense simply isn't running through him as much with him off of the top power play. He's down around 26%, which is obviously not great. He's actually still outperforming his individual expected goal rate by about the same amount that he was able to do in his most successful seasons the last 2 years, in which he's managed to about double his actual goals versus his individual expected goal rate. The fact that he is still about doubling his individual expected goals rate with his goal total of 3 this season is why I think we have some concern about him. This is not a case where he is simply, regressing hard in the other direction there. His offensive zone starts are at about 46%. It's down from last year, but still a point above what he was doing in his best season 2 years ago when he scored his 10 goals. The area that is really suffering for Dumba is his total assists per 60. He's only getting a quarter of an assist for every 60 minutes he is spending on the ice. That's below last year's totals of 0.4 total assists per 60 and less than a third of what he was able to accomplish 2 years ago when he was up at 0.82 assists per 60. With the Wild scoring less and Dumba off power play 1, I don't know if that plummeting assist number along with his IPP are bound to regress all that much to the positive. Yes, we did see Jared Spurgeon leave with an injury, so I think it is worth waiting around on him just to see how Spurgeon is doing and if he is expected to be out for any significant length of time. But I am ready to dump Matt Dumba.
Yes, that does not sound ideal. Let's look at our third snoozer this week. I'm talking about another desert dog. I'm talking about Oliver Ekman-Larsson. He is 80% owned in Yahoo, 100% owned in the Cupful once again. 10 points to start the year, and that is a 28-point pace for a player who's supposed to be a de facto Power Play 1 anchor, pushing for 50+. So he has another 0-point game tonight, and while he is back on the top unit after getting bumped for Jakub Chychrun earlier this year, there's a reason to be concerned about Arizona's lack of production. I do think the scariest thing about OEL is that there's nothing tremendously unsustainable about his performance. His personal shooting percentage is a little low, but not so low that it screams huge upswing in the future. Worse, his shot rates are falling, as are his hit rates. I'm starting to think he's about the same as a Goligoski or a Chychrun, rather than being that full tier ahead of them that I would have pegged him for in the preseason. So while I do think that OEL should be more of maybe a 40-45 point player in a season long, assuming his power play deployment can hold, it's tough to recommend holding him in shallow formats. In Deep League, I do think he's dumpable if you're in a must-win matchup and his schedule is really bad, or if there's someone really, really appealing on the waiver wire and you don't have another drop. His ceiling just isn't what it used to be. So I do think that in shallower formats, it is time to say goodbye to the boy, OEL.
And this was a guy that we sort of have been waiting to sort of turn the corner and get past some of the challenges that he's faced, both personal and in terms of injuries that he experienced. And I'm wondering if we are at the point where we think he might not get there to sort of be the guy that we hoped he might eventually be.
Yeah, I would definitely say that we've seen the best of OEL. I'm not saying we've seen all we'll see of him, but definitely a reason to be concerned moving forward. Lewis, why don't you tell us about your final player tonight?
So my last player that I am wondering if we hold out hope or dump is Anders Lee. This is a guy who I have really enjoyed having my fantasy teams in the past, putting up plenty of shots, scoring goals. Kind of a classic Cy Young guy with lots of goals and not too many assists, but taking lots of shots and a guy who hits as well. Lee is on a 41-point pace to start the season, and that's with 3 points in the last 3 games, including 2 points over the lowly Red Wings. These are his only points that he's managed in his last 10 games. His even strength IPP is right around his average at 61%. He's not much of a distributor, as I mentioned, so really goals are sort of where we are relying on him, so we're not super surprised to see that IPP not especially high. Even strength on ice shooting percentage is almost exactly in line with the last 2 years and is pretty average at 9.57. Shots per 60 look normal. And again, this is a player who, despite his low totals, is overperforming his even strength individual expected goals by about 50%. The place where you really start to see some concern is on the power play. Would you believe me if I told you that Anders Lee has 100% PPIPP?
I hate when you say it like that.
One of my favorite stats. So he has an assist on the only goal that his power play unit has been able to produce during 48 minutes of power play time this season. Worse, his 0 goals is only 1 goal behind his individual expected goals metric on the power play. He's pacing for less than 60% of his individual expected goals on the power play compared to last year, and we don't know if he is capable of turning those expected goals into goals on the power play. So this is a grim situation for him to be in power play wise. Stuck on that second power play, which is not especially effective. It really is looking tough for him. I might hold him in a league that counts hit and blocks if there aren't any tastier options out there. But I think if you are in a points league, or if there is anything vaguely interesting on the waiver wire, and Alex Tuck, for instance, I would be ready to dump Anders Lee and pick up someone with a little more flash.
I think I'm with you. I would drop Anders Lee for Alex Tuck while he has this deployment. My hope would be that while Anders Lee is on the waiver wire, he maybe gets better deployment, and I can see about adding him later on while nobody decides to check if he still has signs of life, because it's just been such a slow start to the year.
Yeah, and not the kind of thing that you want to see, especially when he, is getting pretty nice even strength deployment and just not really producing a whole lot with it.
Absolutely. Lewis, that's all we have time for today. For myself, Ben Burnett, I'm signing out of here. Lewis, why don't you take us home?
All right, well, we want to extend our appreciation to Yahoo, Natural Stat Trick, at Game Day Lines, Left Wing Lock, Daily Faceoff for helping us with our research for this episode. Please give us a follow on Twitter at AVG Time on Ice, at Keeping Karlsson. Until we see you next time, play smart and keep your shifts short.